And in my talk, I will present some reflections about the ancient mechanisms of text and textuality as they can be observed from the Greek papyri survived to us, which are the very material witnesses, and as they can be enhanced by modern digital representations. And I will start with a couple of, sorry, I have to rearrange my screen, otherwise I cannot see my PowerPoint. Couple of linguistic definitions of text. What is a text from the linguistic viewpoint? There can be many definitions, of course. I selected two of them where you can find some interesting observations about some features of the concept of text. A text is a unit of language. News is best regarded as a semantic unit, a unit not of form but of meaning. So here what is stressed is the importance of the semantics of text. In the second definition, text is a naturally occurring manifestation of language that is as a communicative language event in a context. The surface text is the set of expressions actually used. These expressions make some knowledge explicit, while other knowledge remains implicit, though still applied during processing. So from this definition, it's clear that text is not only what we see or what we hear, if the text is an oral communication, but there is something behind it. There is a sort of different dimension or dimensions in plural behind the surface of the text that we can see or hear. And there is also in this definition a description of a sort of what I would call interactive text or interacting text. Because if there is a surface text and some implicit knowledge behind it, the text itself interacts with its user in order to communicate him all these dimensions which lie behind it. This idea of an interacting text reminds us, of course, about the ancient dichotomy between oral text and written text. All of us probably know very well that passage of Plato's Phaedrus, where a strong criticism against writing or against a certain type of writing is conducted, and Plato's criticism is based exactly on this concept of interaction. Plato says that written texts are of lower quality than oral texts because they are basically static, unchanging, unselective. They cannot select their audience, they cannot interact, they cannot dialogue with their users, while an oral text is a living text, is an interacting text. So it is, so to say, interactive. If we look at the material witnesses of ancient written texts, such as the Greek papyri that came down to us mostly from Greco-Roman Egypt, we are entitled to ask ourselves if ancient written texts were really non-interactive, and this is the main point of my presentation. And I will show you some few examples of what are, in my opinion, ancient interactive text, and I will show you how they are represented in modern digital terms, and how digital representation can help us understanding, I think, better than traditional or paper representations, so traditional editions, this interactive dimension of ancient text. I will start very quickly with a field that we usually associate to a fixed or static text, that is philology. Most of us understand philology, or at least a large part of philology, as the activity of trying to reconstruct the original aspect, the original aspect of a text, and to fix it in its best form, so to say. Ancient philology, represented wonderfully by this piece of papyrus. This is the famous Hawara Homer. This is a Homeric roll from 2nd century AD. This is not really close, chronologically close to Alexandrian philology, but it's usually thought to be very close to Alexandrian methodology, Alexandrian philological methodology. And how did Alexandrian philologists act in order to have what now we call a critical edition of a text? They did collate some copies, some circulating copies of the text. They did not build an ideal edition of Homer, but they chose what they thought to be the best copy, the best circulating copy of Homer, and they annotated it with famous critical signs. We see here in the margins some of these signs, and they annotated comments, notes, marginal notes. We see something here on the top right of the picture. It's not really visible, but I believe that you can perceive some writing here. So their critical edition was not, so to say, a fixed ideal text, but in some way an interacting text. They started from one of the many circulating texts, and they interplay with it, adding notes, adding comments, marking verses to be deleted with the famous obelos, like those small horizontal lines here, but without actually deleting them, just by marking them with these obeloi. So they, so to say, create a sort of interactive text, able to dialogue, able to interact with its user. Let's turn to the digital side of the issue. So what we intend as a text, and in my special case, a papyrus text, also from the digital viewpoint. This is the definition of papyrus text taken from the Trismegistos database. And I won't go through the entire definition because time is running, but I want to drive your attention to the fact that, first of all, they define the TM number. This Trismegistos number is a unique number that this Trismegistos catalog assigns to one single papyrus text. And here they explain how they assign a TM number to a text. They say that a TM number identifies records corresponding to a single document or a book, and that's fine. But then they go on and say that in the majority of cases, no distinction has to be made between a document or book, which is identified by the number, the physical object, for example, a papyrus, and the text, for example, a demotic letter. So there are several dimensions behind the concept of document or the concept of book, that is the concept of text, generally speaking. We can have the document as a whole, we can have the material object, and we can have the text written on these material objects. And the relationships between the text and the object, or between the object and the document, can be various. And this is the problem the TM people face and describe in this introductory page of their catalog. I would like to make all of this clear with a couple of examples. This is a letter from 3rd century AD, where the sender is reminding the receiver about a delayed payment. And to make his request more stronger, he adds to the left-hand margin here, written perpendicular with respect to the body of the text, a Homeric quotation, a quotation from the first two verses of the second book of the Iliad, where everyone, gods and heroes, are described as sleeping, but Zeus, who is awake and who watches everything. And here the ironic relationship between the Homeric quotation and the main text is clear. So everyone is sleeping, the receiver of the letter is not paying what he has to pay, and the sender is awake, just as Zeus in the Iliad, and is reminding about the payment due. Now we have a main text, the letter, and we have a sort of postscriptum. We have a sort of marginal quotation, which is not part of the main text, but is intrinsically connected to the very topic of the text. And here is how the paper edition is trying to represent this particular disposition of the text. It is a mostly diplomatic edition, as you can see. There are no accents, no spirits, so that it's possible to note that here the original scribe added a sort of apostrophe in the original text. It tries to respect in some way the layout of the document. The greetings at the beginning are separated from the main text, and here there is an indentation just as in the original text, and the marginal quotation is transcribed perpendicularly on the left. There is not an exact correspondence, of course, as you can see in this graphical representation, but the idea is that this paper edition tries to represent what we can see on the papyrus document. And there is, as you can see, no apparatus criticus. The few linguistic remarks, few linguistic variations. Here we have de instead of do. Here we have caterchete instead of caterchetai, are just marked with this sic below the word, and here also panuchi instead of panuchioi in the Homeric quotation. So this is the printed edition, the paper edition of this letter. Let's turn now to the digital edition of this document, or better, perhaps, to the digital representation of this document. This is from papyri.info database, which is the reference database for ancient Greek papyrus text, where we find metadata, which means contextual information about the papyrus, date, provenance, publication, and so on, and the very text encoding after the TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, conventions. Now, what we see in the digital representation of this document is that the main text is transcribed here with an apparatus criticus. So this is the first difference with from the printed edition, and gets a Trismegistos number, a unique Trismegistos number corresponding to the text. And we have also the marginal quotation transcribed, okay? But then we discover that in the very same database, there is another record with another Trismegistos number, which refers only to the marginal quotation, because this is a Homeric text, so this is a literary text, and it has been transcribed in another section of the very same database, which is devoted to the literary papyri. So this is a sort of inconsistency in treating our textual data, which starts from somehow artificial distinction between documentary and literary text. But this is interesting because when we turn to the digital world, we have some problems in dealing with some kind of complex documents, which in a printed edition, they are presented, so to say, in a two-dimensional way. It's just one layer of information, the text represented as it is on the papyrus. When we turn to the digital world, where we have several opportunities to represent the text and the information about the text, we start having some problems. We try to adapt this text to a multidimensional environment. For example, one dimension is the main text, another dimension is the apparatus criticus, where the regularizations of the linguistic variations that we find in the main text are recorded. Another dimension is represented by the metadata, the information about the papyrus, which were lacking, as you saw, in the printed edition. So there is some kind of problems. And I have another very quick example. This is a document, again, from the 3rd century AD. This is a register of official letters. There are 3 official letters transcribed, the first 2 by one scribe and the third one by a second scribe, so there is a change in the handwriting. Here is the traditional edition, but when we move to the digital edition, we see the very same uncertainties. The papyrus gets a 1 Trismegistos number because it is considered to be as one single piece of papyrus. But then we see that the text is split into 3 different subtexts, so to say, because they say they are 3 different textual instances. The first is the first letter transcribed by one scribe. The second is a second letter transcribed by the very same scribe. The third is a third different letter transcribed by another different scribe. But it takes 1 Trismegistos number. So this is somehow, and of course, other catalogs describe it as one piece because it is one document. It is a register of official letters. So there are some uncertainties, some inconsistencies in treating such complex documents. And there are also cases in a literary papyri. I will be very, very quick because I'm afraid that I'm running out of time, but we have other literary examples. For example, papyri with indications of textual variants, like this one, but there are lots of examples. So a scribe indicating a different version of the text. So we have, so to say, two parallel texts, two different and parallel texts within one single document. And the examples could be really many. But I jump to my conclusions, and my conclusions that can be, of course, discussed at the end of our panel is that we should look at ancient documents not as unique things, but as multidimensional texts, multidimensional keepers of information. And here I have listed some possible dimensions, some possible layers of text that we can find in one single papyrus piece, our letter, the letter from which we started. The numbering is random. It doesn't mean that level 8 is more important than level 0 or the other way around. It's just to show you what can we see from this ancient document. We have a level related to the context, the information, the contextual information of the text. We have the materiality level, the papyrus itself, the sheet itself, the very textual content. Then I borrow some terms from Gérard Genet's textual theory in order to represent the relationship between the text and other information pertaining to the same text. We have a relationship with a larger textual genre, triggered here by formulaic and standard epistolary phrases, like the greetings at the beginning or at the end. We have the semiotic value of graphical and layout devices that we saw that the printed edition tried to represent in some way. We have a level of paleography. Here we have one single scribe changing his hand 3 times. One hand in the main body of the letter, one hand for the final greetings, and one hand for the Homeric quotation, but it's the very same scribe. So this is also a kind of information that we gain from the document and which brings some implicit information. The Homeric quotation, which triggers the ancient knowledge of Homer. It's funny that when we transcribe such a text in both the paper edition or in the digital edition, we feel like indicating, I don't know if you remember, I don't come back because I have no time, but if you remember, both in the printed edition and in the digital representation, we had the citation of Homer in brackets, Hom, Il, A, 1 to 2. Here, there's no need because an ancient reader was directly brought to the Homeric context of this quotation. And my bottom line, the bottom line of my presentation is that this multidimensional text with lots of cross relationships between information and also with other texts, other genres, other kinds of text, acts like what we know as a hypertext. So as a text with connections, with hyperlinks, with other documents. And if we represented such ancient texts with hypertextual digital editions, hypertextual digital representation, this would be a digital critical edition, but this would be also a further step in the very transmission of the text, because we convey the very same network of information conveyed by the very ancient text. So I think I can stop here and thank you for your attention.